Okay, so we're back and we're ready to start looking at render layers. Now this is the beauty pass of the render that we've got. So it's got all the colors in it, it's got all the lights, it's got the shadows. But what we want to have a look at is adding what's known as Z depth and also ambient occlusion. These are two different renders that we can output to actually help us give like a little more play with the image while we're in After Effects. So I'm going to actually save this image by clicking on the Keep Image here. And I'm going to come across to my Render Layers tab. And as you can see here, we've already got the master layer, which is what we see at the moment. So I'm going to right click and click Copy Layer. And then I'm going to do the same thing again, Copy Layer. This one I'm going to call AO, hit Enter. And this top one I'm going to call Z depth, hit Enter. Okay, so at the moment they look exactly the same as our master layer, which is understandable as they're just copies. So we're going to go to the AO, which stands for ambient occlusion. We're going to right click here and go to attributes. And this brings up the attributes for the render layer. Now we can go through and make a whole heap of little adjustments and whatnot to get what we're looking for, but to make things easier, Maya comes with some presets, so we're going to look at those. Now for the ambient occlusion, we're going to go to the second option, which is occlusion. And as you can see, that's just made the entire screen go blank, which is a little difficult to work with, but what we're going to do is just give it a quick render to see what it looks like. At the moment, it doesn't look like much at all because it's just you pretty much have a black silhouette of the scene. So we're going to go across to this occlusion shader and we're going to change the max distance to, let's put in a value of 1 just so that we get an idea of what's happening here. So render again, and you'll see that we're getting these nice little shadows in between any of the objects that are close together. And so this just gives a little bit of internal shadowing, which adds a little bit of depth to the image. This is great in terms of lighting because you can create this effect with basic lightings, but you'll be adding in a lot of lights and a lot of bounces in your final gather passes, which takes up a lot of render time. And as you saw from this render, it only took 4 seconds. So, I mean, that's great. And at the moment, that is looking pretty good. I might dial it down to 0.8 and make another render of that. And that's just made these darker areas a little bit smaller, which is what we want. I'm happy with that, so we're going to move on to the Z depth. And so again, we're going to right click and go to the attributes. And again, in presets, it already has a luminance depth set. So we're going to click on that. And now, so we're going to save this image here so that we can refer back to it later. And just do a test render of this Z depth. At the moment, we've got pretty much the opposite of what the other one was giving us. So we're going to go to our set range, and this is the automatic calculation that it's trying to do. But for now, we're just going to break these connections and put in our own values. So we want the minimum value, so we want the white value to be at 0. And then we want the maximum value to be, let's try 100. Okay, and in the viewport, you can already see that starting to take shape. And we'll give it a render. And you can see this fall off of color from white to black, which is actually dictating how far away the objects are from the camera. Now this is really useful when you're compositing because you can add things like fog and stuff like that to give a sort of depth. And so the fog is thicker in the background and thinner towards the foreground. And it can also add extra shadows, in which case the background looks darker, and there's just so many things that you can do with the Z depth layer. This is very useful in creating things like depth of field. So you have the background or maybe the foreground, which is blurred out, and then you have the crisper center, which is where the eye should be led to focus. So these are our three passes that we're going to create. We've got our color layer, we've got our extra shadow layer, and we've also got our depth layer. So now that we have these set up, because we want to keep an eye on where they're rendering, we're going to right click in here and add render layer name. So that means, and just to keep things nice and neat, we're also going to put an underscore in between cubes and the render layer. And hit enter. And up here you'll see a preview of it, that each of the files will be called cubes_zdepth.0001 PNG. And if it's rendering the AO layer, then it will automatically change to AO. And also for the master layer, it will have master layer written after it. This is great in terms of file organization and not having to render out passes separately, and they won't be spread out to different folders. So naming conventions are a great help, and I recommend that you figure out your own conventions early on so that it is easier to find everything that you make. Okay, so the final thing that we need to look at is back at our colored layer, because we're still getting these jagged edges. So we're going to go back to our render settings, and we're going to go to the quality, and we're going to go down to our production settings. And now we're going to head into indirect lighting. You notice that our final gather has been turned off. So we're going to turn that back on, and because this is going to be our final renders, we want to leave the accuracy higher and turn up the secondary bounces to 2. Now I'm also going to go back to our point light and dial that down even more to 0.2, and also give it a slight shade of blue. So, okay, so I'm going to save this, and I'm going to do another render. Okay, great, so that's finished. But as you can see, after adding those extra settings, our render time has now come up to 3 minutes and 23 seconds, which for this project being fairly small is kind of high. I mean, that's generally because there are so many lights involved in the scene. They're all bouncing off one another and creating these nice little spills of color, but still that's rather high. So what I'm going to do quickly is go into the quality settings, and in the ray tracing, we don't actually have any refractions going on. Refractions are light passing through an object, so I'm just going to dial that down to 1. And the reflections, this is the number of times that a reflection will bounce from one object to another. Now we don't need that to be terribly high because we don't have very detailed reflections anyway. We're going to put that down to 4, and we're going to change our shadow trace depth, and we're going to bring that down to 10. Okay, and I think we should be looking pretty good now, so I'm just going to save that image so that we can compare it. Okay, great, so that's done. We've saved 3 seconds between it, but as you can see, there isn't any real difference between the look of the two of them. So what I'm going to do is actually start this rendering off now. How we're going to do that is by, from this tab here, we're going to go to the rendering menu bar, and we can go to render and batch render, and we'll go to the option box. And here we've got a couple of different options. Most of the time you'll just be using the basic settings, but what you can do is, if you know that you've got a couple of extra threads to work with, you might crank that up a little higher, and then you can click batch render and close, and it'll start rendering in the background. So after these are rendered, I'll come back and we'll have a look at the rendered files and take it into After Effects and composite it all together.